the rifle barrel pressed cold against Cordelia Ravencroft's temple as she stood frozen in her mansion's doorway, watching the Apache warrior tie her foreman to the hitching post with practiced efficiency. 20 years had passed since she'd last seen those obsidian eyes, but her heart recognized Kalen Nightwind immediately, even with a price on his head and blood on his hands. "You shouldn't have come back," she whispered, though her fingers trembled as she slowly lowered the Winchester. The setting sun painted the New Mexico territory in shades of copper and gold, casting long shadows across her sprawling ranch that had made her the wealthiest widow west of the Mississippi. Kellen's weathered face remained impassive as he secured the final knot. But she caught the slight tremor in his hands, the same tremor she remembered from the stolen nights 20 years ago, when he was just another ranch hand and she was the naive daughter of a territorial judge. Before the uprising. Before the massacre. Before everything went to hell. "Your men killed my nephew," he said simply, his English still perfect despite 2 decades of running. "Shot him down like a dog while he was stealing horses." Cordelia's breath caught. She knew about the raid 3 days prior, knew her foreman Brutus had been trigger-happy, but she hadn't known the boy's identity. "Kalen, Mrs. Ravencroft." His formal address cut through her like a blade. "You have a choice. Come with me willingly, or watch me burn this place to the ground with everyone in it." She glanced at Brutus, whose face had gone pale beneath his handlebar mustache. The other ranch hands were nowhere to be seen, either fled or already dealt with. Typical. When faced with a legendary Apache warrior who'd eluded the cavalry for 2 decades, courage became a scarce commodity. "There's another way," she said, stepping onto the porch. The floorboards creaked under her expensive boots that cost more than most people earned in a year. "My influence could clear your name. I have connections in Santa Fe, in Denver, even in Washington." Something flickered across Kellen's features, surprise, perhaps, or pain. "The white woman who owns half the territory wants to save the savage?" His voice carried bitter mockery. How generous. The words stung because they held truth. She had become everything she'd once despised, a wealthy manipulator who controlled lives with ledger books and political favors. But seeing him now, remembering what they'd shared, she felt the young woman she'd buried stirring to life. "I never stopped," she began, but a distant rifle crack cut her off. Kalen spun toward the sound, his hand flying to the knife at his. "Belt. Cavalry," he growled. Someone signaled them. Brutus had managed to work one hand free and was frantically waving a white kerchief. Blood trickled from his split lip as he shouted, "Here! The Apache's here!" Without hesitation, Cordelia raised her Winchester and put a bullet through the kerchief, sending fabric fragments spiraling into the evening air. Both men stared at her in shock. "Well," she said, levering another round into the chamber, "I suppose I've made my choice." The thunder of approaching hooves echoed across the mesa as Cordelia grabbed her saddlebags from inside the mansion. 25 years of careful planning, of building an empire from her late husband's modest cattle operation, of becoming untouchable, all abandoned in the space of a heartbeat for a man who'd haunted her dreams since she was 19. "You're insane," Brutus sputtered, blood streaming from his nose. "They'll hang you for harboring a fugitive." "They'll have to catch me first," she replied, stuffing gold coins and jewelry into the leather pouches. Her hands moved with surprising steadiness despite the magnitude of what she was doing. Outside, Kalen had already saddled her fastest horse somehow. He'd remembered which one. She paused at her husband's portrait above the mantel. Cornelius Ravencroft had been a good man, older and practical, who'd given her security and position after her father disowned her for her shameful association with that half-breed. Their marriage had been comfortable, respectful, even fun, but it had never made her feel alive the way 10 minutes in Kellen's presence did. "Cordelia!" Kellen's urgent voice carried through the walls. They're closing fast. She grabbed her father's silver pocket watch, the only thing of his she'd kept after he'd called her dead to him, and ran. Outside, Kalen waited with their horses, his dark hair streaming in the wind. The sight of him, untamed and dangerous after all these years, made her 20 again. "Can you still ride like you used to?" he asked, swinging onto his paint stallion with fluid grace. "Better," she said, mounting her chestnut mare. "I've had 20 years of practice running this ranch." They rode hard toward the arroyos, leaving behind the mansion that had been her prison and her throne. Behind them, the cavalry crested the hill, a dozen blue-uniformed soldiers led by Captain Morrison, a man she'd entertained at dinner parties and had wrapped around her finger for political favors. "There!" Morrison's voice carried on the wind. "The Ravencroft woman's with him." Bullets whined past their heads as they plunged into the network of canyons that Kalen navigated like he'd been born to them. She followed his lead, trusting instincts she'd thought were long dead. Her elaborate morning dress, black silk that had cost more than a soldier's yearly pay cut on thorny mesquite. But she pressed on. They rode for hours through the labyrinthine passages, their horses' hooves echoing off canyon walls painted with ancient petroglyphs. Finally, as the moon rose full and silver, Kalen called a halt beside a hidden spring. "We'll rest here," he said, dismounting to check his stallion's legs. "The water runs underground. They won't track us past this point." Cordelia slid from her saddle, her legs shaky from the brutal ride. She'd forgotten how demanding this land could be, how it stripped away everything artificial and left only what was essential. Her carefully styled hair had come loose, her dress was torn, her face was streaked with dust and sweat. "You look..." Kalen started, then stopped, his expression unreadable. "Like hell?" she offered wryly. "Like the girl I fell in love with." The words hung between them, heavy with 20 years of separation and pain. She wanted to run to him, to recapture what they'd lost, but too much had changed. She was no longer the idealistic young woman who'd believed love could conquer prejudice and politics. "That girl died a long time ago," she said quietly, "along with the boy who loved her." Kellen's jaw tightened. "Then why are you here?" It was a fair question. Why had she thrown away everything for a man who was essentially a stranger now? Why risk the hangman's noose for someone who represented a past she tried so hard to bury? "Because," she said, meeting his eyes in the moonlight, "some debts can only be paid with everything you have." The hidden Apache camp materialized from the canyon walls like something from a fever dream. Cordelia had heard stories of Kellen's band, a mix of displaced Apache, Mexican outcasts, and white renegades who'd chosen life on the run over submission, but seeing them gathered around flickering fires, she realized the stories hadn't done justice to their fierce unity. "The widow brings soldiers to our sanctuary," spoke an elderly Apache woman, her voice cutting through the murmured conversations. Yelena Stormcrow, Kellen's aunt, regarded Cordelia with eyes that missed nothing. "She brings death with her." "The soldiers were already hunting us," Kalen replied in Apache, then switched to English for Cordelia's benefit. "She chose to stand with us against them." "She chose guilt over gold," Yelena snorted. "What happens when the weight of her conscience grows lighter than her purse?" Cordelia understood more Apache than she let on another secret from her youth, but she let the insult pass. The old woman had earned the right to suspicion. White settlers had broken too many promises, destroyed too many lives. A young man approached, his resemblance to Kalen unmistakable despite the anger blazing in his eyes. "This is Joaquin," Kalen said quietly, "my brother's son." "The one they said you killed," Cordelia breathed, recognizing the boy from wanted posters. The bounty on his head was nearly as high as Kellen's. "Your foreman's bullet grazed his skull," Joaquin said, his English heavily accented but clear. Left him for dead while they took our horses. But Chiricahua are hard to kill. She studied the jagged scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, a permanent reminder of her world's violence. I'm sorry. If I'd known, you'd have what? Stopped them? Joaquin's laugh held no humor. You white women, you think your tears wash away blood. Enough, Kellen's voice carried absolute authority. She's under my protection now. And when she betrays us? Yelena asked. When the cavalry offers her a pardon in exchange for our location. Before Cordelia could respond, a commotion erupted at the camp's edge. 3 riders thundered in, scouts returning with urgent news. Their leader, a scarred Mexican named Esteban, slid from his horse with fluid grace. Federals from the south, he reported breathlessly. Colonel Vasquez leads 200 men. They're pushing the survivors from Tres Rios ahead of them like cattle. Kalen cursed in Apache. Tres Rios had been their winter camp, home to nearly 50 families. Survivors? Maybe 20. Women and children, mostly. They'll be here by dawn, but the Federals are only hours behind. The tactical situation was impossible. Pressed between American cavalry from the north and Mexican forces from the south, with innocents arriving who would need protection, Kellen's band faced annihilation. There's another option, Cordelia said quietly. Every eye turned to her. She took a breath, knowing her next words would either save them or damn them all. My ranch has underground passages, part of the original Spanish mining operation. They connect to the old mission ruins 5 miles east. You could move the women and children through them. And walk into another trap? Joaquin spat. The passages are on my land. Legally, the cavalry can't search them without a federal warrant. She met Kellen's gaze. And I know Judge Morrison. He's the captain's father. He owes me favors. Yelena studied her with new interest. You would stake your life on these legal papers? I'm staking all our lives on them. A long silence fell over the camp. Finally, Kalen spoke. It's our best chance. But Cordelia, this is some elaborate scheme to claim the bounties. Then, I'm the most patient woman in the territory, she said dryly. 20 years is a long time to plan a betrayal. Despite everything, Kalen almost smiled. You always were too clever for your own good. As the camp began preparations for the desperate gambit, Cordelia found herself alone with Yelena by the dying fire. The old woman studied her with ancient eyes. You loved him once, Yelena said. It wasn't a question. I loved who he was. Who I was when I was with him. And now? Cordelia looked across the camp at Kalen, organizing the evacuation with quiet efficiency. His presence commanding absolute loyalty from people who had every reason to trust no one. Now I love who he became, she admitted, even if it destroys me. The underground passages reeked of decades-old decay and bat guano, but they might as well have been lined with gold for all Cordelia cared. Watching Kalen guide 20 terrified Apache women and children through the narrow tunnels, his voice gentle as he spoke words of comfort in their native tongue, she remembered why she'd fallen in love with him in the first place. The support beam here is rotted, whispered Consuela, an elderly woman carrying her granddaughter. It could collapse. Kalen examined the ancient timber with practiced eyes. We shore it up or find another way. We don't leave anyone behind. Above them, boots thundered across the mansion's floors. Through the grating that connected to her wine cellar, Cordelia could hear Captain Morrison interrogating her servants. She'd sent most of her staff away that morning with generous severance pay and instructions to visit family in Santa Fe. Only old Henrik, the cook, and Maria, the housekeeper, remained, both loyal enough to lie convincingly about seeing nothing unusual. Search every room, Morrison commanded. That Apache lover is hiding something. The words stung less than they once might have. She'd been called worse things by better people. Joaquin appeared at her elbow, moving with a silent grace that made Apache warriors legendary. The Federals have reached the northern pass. Colonel Vasquez is spreading his men across the mouth of the canyon. How long do we have? Kalen asked, never taking his attention from the children. An hour, maybe 2. Not enough time. The tunnel system was extensive but treacherous, and they were moving at the pace of the eldest and youngest. Among them, little Ayana, barely 6 years old, had already stumbled twice, her small legs struggling with the uneven footing. Without hesitation, Cordelia knelt and scooped the girl into her arms. "Ride with me, Pickwaigan." Ayana's dark eyes widened with fear and curiosity. She'd probably never been held by a white woman before, certainly not one whose jewelry could feed a family for months. "She's afraid," murmured the girl's mother, a young woman named Idzel, whose husband had died in the cavalry's latest raid. "So am I," Cordelia admitted. "But fear doesn't have to stop us." They pressed deeper into the tunnels, following passages that hadn't seen human traffic since the Spanish abandoned their mining operations 50 years earlier. Cordelia's expensive dress caught on every protrusion, tearing away in strips until she looked more like a refugee than a wealthy widow. Irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent 20 years building walls between herself and the world that had rejected her. Love for Kalen walls made of money and influence and carefully cultivated respectability. Now those same walls were crumbling with every step deeper into the earth. "There's an opening ahead," Esteban called back from his position as scout, "but we have a problem." They emerged into a natural cavern where underground springs had carved cathedral-like spaces from the living rock. Beautiful as it was, the chamber presented a tactical nightmare. 3 passages led deeper into the mountain, but only one led toward the old mission. "The other 2 are dead ends," Kalen said, studying scratches on the walls that marked old explorations. "But if we choose wrong, ... "We don't choose wrong," Cordelia said firmly. She pulled out her father's pocket watch, its silver surface catching the lamplight. "My father surveyed these tunnels for the territorial government. He scratched marks on the walls barely visible unless you know what to look for." She moved along the cavern wall, running her fingers over seemingly random scratches until she found what she sought, 3 small crosses arranged in a triangle. Her father's personal mark, indicating the safe passage. "This way," she said, pointing to the leftmost tunnel dot above them. Explosions echoed through the rock as someone, either the cavalry or the Federals, began dynamiting potential hiding places. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and several children began to cry. "Sing," Yelena commanded in Apache. "Sing the traveling song. Let the mountain know we mean no harm." The women's voices rose in harmony, an ancient melody that seemed to make the very walls pulse with life. Even Cordelia found herself humming along, the tune somehow familiar despite her never having heard it before. As they moved through the final passage toward the mission ruins, Kalen fell into step beside her. Ayana had fallen asleep in her arms, her small hand clutching Cordelia's torn sleeve. "She trusts you," he observed quietly. "Children and fools," Cordelia murmured. "They're the only ones who see clearly. Which are you?" She considered the question as they approached the faint light that marked the tunnel's end. Behind them lay everything she'd built: her fortune, her status, her carefully constructed life. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and probable death. "Both," she said finally. "Definitely both." The ruins of Mission Santa Esperanza crumbled against the dawn sky like broken teeth, but to Cordelia they looked like salvation. The Apache families emerged from the tunnels like ghosts materializing from the earth, blinking in the pale light after hours underground. They'd made it, but barely. "Riders approaching from the east," Joaquin announced from his position atop the mission's bell tower. 20 men, maybe more, Kalen cursed under his breath. They'd expected to have until midday before anyone thought to search the ruins. Cavalry or federals? Neither, Joaquin called down. They're flying a white flag. That changed everything. In Apache territory, white flags usually meant one of two things: surrender or parley. Given that they were outnumbered and outgunned, Cordelia hoped for the latter. The riders crested the hill in perfect formation. Their leader, a man Cordelia recognized with a sinking heart, Judge Morrison, Captain Morrison's father and one of the most powerful men in the territory. She'd dined at his table, donated to his campaigns, even helped arrange his son's promotion. Now he would decide whether she lived or died. "Cordelia Ravencroft," the judge called out, his voice carrying easily across the ruins. "I've come too. Offer you terms." She stepped forward, still holding little Ayanna, who had refused to leave her arms. Behind her, the Apache families huddled in the mission's nave, ready to fight or flee as circumstances demanded. "What terms?" she called back. "Surrender the Apache, and you'll face only charges of harboring fugitives. Refuse, and you'll hang alongside them for treason against the United States." "And the families?" Judge Morrison's face hardened. "They're not part of this negotiation," which meant death. The families would be shipped to reservations in Florida or Oklahoma if they survived the journey. The warriors would face military tribunals and inevitable execution. "I need to discuss this with my associates," Cordelia said. The judge checked his pocket watch, not unlike her father's. She noted with bitter amusement, "You have 10 minutes." She retreated to the mission nave, where Kalen waited with murder in his eyes. "We fight," he said. "Simply, better to die here than in chains." "Speak for yourself," Yelena snapped. "These children deserve better than your noble death." "The old woman's right," Esteban added. "We can't win against 50 guns." 53, Joaquin corrected, sliding down from the bell tower. "More riders just appeared on the southern ridge. Looks like the federals found us too. Perfect. Trapped between American justice and Mexican vengeance, with innocents caught in the crossfire." Cordelia looked down at Ayanna, who gazed back with the absolute trust that only children possessed. In those dark eyes, she saw not just one little girl, but every child who'd suffered for the adults' failures and prejudices. "There's another option," she said quietly. The group fell silent. Even the children seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. "I have something Judge Morrison wants more than Apache scalps," she continued. "Information about Mexican silver smuggling through his son's military district. Captain Morrison's been taking bribes to look the other way, and I have documents that prove it." Kellen's eyes narrowed. "You'd betray your own people to save ours?" "They stopped being my people the moment they made me choose between love and acceptance." She stood, settling Ayanna more comfortably in her arms. "Besides, corrupt officials aren't my people. They're nobody's people. And if Morrison calls your bluff?" Yelena asked. Cordelia smiled grimly. "Then we're no worse off than we are now." She walked back to face Judge Morrison, her torn dress fluttering in the desert wind. Behind her, she could feel the Apache family's hope and desperation like a physical weight. "Judge Morrison," she called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent 20 years commanding respect through wealth and influence. "I have a counter-proposal." "I'm listening." "Safe passage for the women and children to the San Carlos reservation. Clemency for the warriors who surrender voluntarily. And a full pardon for myself." The judge laughed harshly. "In exchange for what?" Cordelia reached into her saddlebag and withdrew a leather portfolio, the same one she'd grabbed during their desperate flight from her mansion. "In exchange for every document I possess regarding certain financial irregularities in your son's command. Irregularities that certain parties in Washington would find enlightening." The judge's face went pale. Behind him, His men shifted nervously, sensing their leader's sudden uncertainty. "You're bluffing," Morrison said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" Cordelia opened the portfolio just enough to reveal official letterheads and military seals. "Shall we find out?" The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. In the distance, thunder rumbled. Whether from approaching storms or approaching Federals, Cordelia couldn't tell. Either way, time was running out. Finally, Judge Morrison nodded curtly. "The women and children may go to San Carlos. The warriors will face military justice. You?" He paused, studying her with the cold calculation that had made him a territorial. "Power. You have 24 hours to disappear. If I ever see you in this territory again, those documents won't save you." It wasn't everything she'd hoped for, but it was enough. The innocent would live. "Agreed," she said that the parting at San Carlos felt like watching her heart tear in half. Cordelia knelt beside Ayanna, who clung to her with the fierce desperation of a child who'd lost too much already. Around them, other families prepared for separation as the men faced uncertain military justice while women and children entered the reservation's confines. "You'll come see me?" Ayanna whispered in her ear, her small fingers clutching Cordelia's torn sleeve. "Someday, Pequega," Cordelia promised, though she knew it was likely a lie. "Exiles rarely returned. But you'll be strong without me, stronger than you know." Itzel, Ayanna's mother, pressed a small beaded necklace into Cordelia's hands. "For remembering," she said simply, "and for being mother to my daughter when I could not protect her." The words hit harder than any bullet. Cordelia fastened the necklace around her throat, feeling the weight of the beads like a chain of responsibility that would follow her forever. Judge Morrison's men had withdrawn after securing the warriors. Surrender, but their presence lingered like smoke in the air. Kalen stood in shackles, his face impassive as stone, but she caught the slight nod he gave her, approval, gratitude, and goodbye all in one simple gesture. "Time to go, Señora," Esteban said quietly. He'd volunteered to escort her to the Mexican border, along with 3 other men who'd chosen exile over reservation life. "The Federals are asking questions in Tucson." She rose from her knees, leaving behind the last of her old life as completely as she'd abandoned her mansion. The woman who'd been the richest widow in the territory no longer existed. In her place stood someone harder, simpler, and strangely more alive. They rode south through landscapes that seemed carved from pure light, mesas that glowed like beaten copper, arroyos that twisted through red stone like ancient script, skies so vast they made human concerns feel infinitely small. Cordelia had forgotten how beautiful the world could be when stripped of civilization's comfortable lies. On the second day, they encountered a Mexican patrol. The lieutenant in charge was barely 20, his uniform crisp with newness and naivety. "Papers, Señora," he demanded in careful English. Cordelia handed over documents Esteban had procured in Santa Fe papers identifying her as Esperanza Morelos, widow of a Mexican merchant. The forgery was excellent, but more importantly, the name carried weight. The real Esperanza Morelos had died childless in Guadalajara 6 months earlier, leaving behind a small fortune and no close relatives. "You're traveling light for a woman of means," the lieutenant observed, noting their sparse belongings. "Bandits," Cordelia replied smoothly. "They took everything except what I'm wearing." It wasn't entirely a lie. She'd lost everything, just not to bandits. The lieutenant studied her torn dress, her sun-darkened face, her calloused hands that no longer looked like they belonged to territorial nobility. Whatever he saw convinced him. With a curt nod, he returned the papers and waved them through. "You're getting good at lying," Esteban observed as they made camp that evening beside a creek that wound through cottonwoods. "I'm getting good at surviving," she corrected. "They're not the same thing." but survival felt hollow without purpose. As they traveled deeper into Mexico, she found herself wondering what came next. The Esperanza Morales identity gave her access to modest wealth and respectability, but it also trapped her in another set of expectations and limitations. On the seventh day, they reached the town of Piedras Negras, where Esteban had family. It was a rough place, full of miners and smugglers and people who'd learned not to ask too many questions about the past. Perfect for someone starting over. "This is where we part ways," Esteban said as they dismounted in front of a cantina called El Corazon Perdido. "My cousin runs this place. She'll help you get established." Cordelia nodded, understanding that she was truly alone now. The other men would scatter to their own destinations, carrying pieces of her story but never the whole truth. "What will?" "You do?" Esteban asked. She looked around at the dusty street, the rough adobe buildings, the people who moved with the careful alertness of those who lived on society's margins. It wasn't much, but it was honest in a way her old life had never been. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I'll figure it out." As Esteban and his companions rode away, Cordelia stood alone in the Mexican dust with nothing but the clothes on her back, a few pieces of jewelry, and a beaded necklace that reminded her of the only choice she'd ever made that truly mattered. For the first time in 20 years, she felt free. 5 years had transformed Esperanza Morales into a woman the territorial elite would never recognize. Her hands, once soft from servants' care, now bore the calluses of honest work. Her skin had been bronzed by desert sun, and her eyes held depths that came from seeing the world's true face. She ran a small school for miners' children in Piedras Negras, teaching them to read and write in both Spanish and English skills that might someday lift them from the dust. The morning's first surprise came with little Carlos Mendoza, who burst into her classroom with news that would change everything. "Senora Morales, the Apache are coming. My father says they're riding this way with soldados americanos." Her blood turned to ice. Apache meant only one possibility somehow, against all odds. Some of her old friends had survived. The American soldiers could mean rescue or recapture, depending on whose side they served. She dismissed class early, sending the children home with strict instructions to stay close to their families. Then she climbed to the church bell tower that overlooked the desert approach, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the shimmering heat, she counted the riders: 12 Apache, 8 American cavalry. No prisoners, no shackles. They rode as equals under a white flag. Leading them, unmistakable even at distance, sat a figure she'd never thought to see again. Kalen had aged in the 5 years since San Carlos. Silver threaded his black hair, and new scars marked his weathered face. But his posture remained straight, proud, unbroken. Beside him rode a young cavalry officer she didn't recognize, and behind them came faces that made her heart sing, Joaquin. Several of the warriors who'd surrendered at the mission, even old Yelena on a gentle Pinto Mare, they reached the town square as curious residents gathered to stare. Kellen's eyes found hers immediately, as if he'd known exactly where to look. The years collapsed between them like shadows before sunrise. The young cavalry officer, lieutenant by his insignia, dismounted first. "I'm looking for Senora Esperanza Morales," he announced in careful Spanish. "I am she," Cordelia replied, descending from the tower on legs that felt strangely weak. "Lieutenant James Whitmore, United States Army," he said, offering a formal salute. "I bear messages from the territorial governor and Judge Morrison." At the mention of Morrison's name, several of the Apache shifted restlessly. But Kalen raised a hand for calm, his attention focused entirely on her. "What messages?" she asked. Whitmore opened his dispatch case and withdrew an official document. "A full presidential pardon for all charges related to your departure from the territory." Judge Morrison has also been relieved of his duties pending investigation into the irregularities you documented." She blinked in amazement. "His son?" "Cashiered and facing court-martial for corruption. Your evidence was quite thorough." The bitter satisfaction she'd expected didn't come. Instead, she felt only tired relief that justice had finally caught up with the Morrison family's corruption. "There's more," Whitmore continued. "The Apache under Kalen Nightwind's leadership have agreed to serve as scouts for the territorial militia. In exchange, they've been granted full citizenship rights and permission to establish a settlement on their ancestral lands." This was unprecedented. Apache as American citizens? It spoke to changes in the territorial government that she could hardly believe. "And you're here because—" Lieutenant Whitmore glanced at Kalen, who finally spoke. "Because we need someone to teach the children. Someone who understands both worlds." The offer hung in the desert air like heat shimmer, full of impossible possibility. Return to the territory that had exiled her, but return with purpose and protection. Build something new from the ruins of the old. The school would be on Apache land, Kalen continued, his voice carefully neutral, but serving children from all the nearby settlements. White, Mexican, Apache, anyone who wants to learn. She could picture it a place where Ayanna could grow up literate and proud, where children learned that different didn't mean dangerous. It would be difficult, controversial, probably dangerous. Perfect for a woman who'd already risked everything. Once, there would be opposition, she said. There always is, Yelena spoke for the first time, her ancient voice carrying across the square. But children care nothing for the fears of their elders. They learn what we teach them. Cordelia looked around at the faces watching her townspeople who'd accepted Esperanza Morelos but never suspected her true identity. Apache warriors who'd followed Kalen into the impossible dream of peace with honor, young soldiers who represented a new generation of territorial leadership. Then she looked at Kalen, really looked at him. The boy she'd loved was gone, replaced by a man who'd led his people through decades of war and somehow found a path to peace. But in his eyes, she saw something that made her breath catch, not the desperate passion of youth, but the steady warmth of mature love that had survived separation, exile, and the weight of years. "When do we start?" she asked. The smile that spread across his weathered features was worth 5 years of exile, worth the loss of everything she'd thought she wanted. Around them, Apache voices rose in quiet celebration while townspeople muttered among themselves about the strange turn of events. As the afternoon sun painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Cordelia no longer Esperanza. Never again the territorial widow walked beside Kalen toward horses that would carry them home to a future neither could have imagined but both had helped create. Behind them, the church bells of Piedras Negras rang the evening call to prayer. Ahead lay the territory that had rejected their love 25 years ago, now ready to accept the gift of their hard-won wisdom. Some debts, she'd learned, could only be paid by becoming worthy of redemption. And some loves were patient enough to wait for the world to change.